This section is on sugar, and we'll focus on added versus naturally occurring sugars. Let's start with a review. Remember that disaccharides mean there are two sugars, so it's a double sugar too. So the sucrose has fructose and glucose, and here it shows how it digests. It digests down to fructose, this 5-ring, and then glucose, this 6-ring. Maltose is 2 glucose linked together. It's just going to digest to glucose, which is also a monosaccharide, single sugar. Lactose, this will digest to glucose and galactose. So all of these are the double sugars, and all of these, fructose, glucose, galactose, are the single sugars or monosaccharides. And I have some images on here just because we're going to start thinking about how these sugars occur in foods. Sucrose is kind of better known as table sugar. So that's the sugar that you're going to see on your table or that you would buy at the store. It digests down to fructose. Fructose is common in, a good source is fruits. It can be also in grains or vegetables, but mostly we think about fruits. F and F, fruit, fructose, that's easy to remember. Sucrose also digests down to glucose. Now this is supposed to be a picture of a bloodstream. I don't know if you could catch that or see that, but glucose is the main sugar in our bloodstream. Now maltose, I have a picture of a grain here, malt grain. That's what they bake a lot of beer out of, right? So you've probably heard of malt. Well, the sugar in malt is called maltose. That is 2 glucose linked together, the 6-carbon ring. Lactose is the sugar found in milk. It's in tiny, tiny little amounts in some other naturally occurring in some other foods. However, it is mostly in milk. So it digests down to galactose and into glucose. So what is an added sugar? Added sugar is any sugar that is added to a food. So when you look on an ingredient list, you will look for, one clue is to look for something that says ose, fructose, sucrose, right? Maltose. Maltose isn't commonly added, but you can see how the ose is a giveaway. However, sometimes that'll trick you because cellulose is a fiber additive. It's a fiber, but it's added to food commonly, so you'll see it on a food label. So that's a fiber, not a sugar. So just be familiar with your monosaccharides and your disaccharides and, look for the ose, but then take a deeper dive into that and see if it actually is a sugar. Remember, a sugar is a disaccharide or a monosaccharide. Those are simple carbohydrates, but they're also called simple sugars. Another way to identify a sugar in a food product is to look for syrup, sweetener, and even concentrated juice. Here's a list of common added sugars. There are dozens and dozens, and it gets complicated about these different synthetic varieties of added sugars that they create and whether the FDA has labeled them kind of starch fragments or added sugars. Like maltodextrin is really a starch fragment. That's a food additive, but it has some added sugars. I don't expect you to know all that. That's all food science. This is nutrition. I do expect you to know is to know the basic types of sugar that you can look at a label and say, oh, cane sugar, or even cane syrup, or corn syrup, or honey, and say, oh, if this is on an ingredient label, meaning that they have added it to the product, then it is an added sugar. It means it's not naturally occurring in the food. So let's just take an example, and this is Cheerios, chocolate Cheerios, because of course we need chocolate in our Cheerios, right? And let's take a look at the ingredient list. We have whole grain oats, and what is the second ingredient is sugar. Then we have oat bran, and then we have corn syrup. So right away, the second and fourth ingredients are added sugars. So let's look at a couple of other these. Starch is a complex carbohydrate. It is not a simple carbohydrate. It is not a sugar. Unsweetened chocolate. Okay, so if it was just chocolate, they would probably list all the ingredients in it, and one would be sugar. But unsweetened means sweetener has not been added, meaning no sugar has been added. So there's no sugar in unsweetened chocolate. Same with cocoa. Not that you would know this, but cocoa doesn't naturally have sugar. But if it is not an added sugar. So it's not something that's taken out of a food, processed, and then put back in. Caramel color. Again, this is another tricky one, right? You think, oh, well, caramel has sugar. However, this is a synthetic additive for color. And the key is color. So if it says caramel flavor, caramel color, these are just flavors and colors. Yeah, if you Google it, you're probably going to find that maybe there's a tiny little bit of sugar in there. But that's not really what I'm looking for. Those are food additives for color, for flavor. And these are all different. They're not your typical added sugars that are the main contributors. So that's what I want you to be able to recognize. And salt, we know that's a mineral. We'll get to that later when we cover minerals. Canola oil, we'll cover lipids. We'll get more into that. But the oils are not sugars. So at this point, you should be able to differentiate between something that might have like a whole food, whole grain oats. That's essentially a whole food that has mostly complex carbohydrates. That's not a sugar. And here we only have these two sugars, sugar and corn syrup. And look at that here. I enlarged that so it'd be easier to see. Then I forgot that I put the enlarge on there. But now you can really see the sugar and the corn syrup in there. So let's look at the nutrition facts panel. I'm not going to go through all of it. I just want to look at the total sugars, which is 10 grams. And look at this. It includes added sugars. How much? 10 grams. So what does that tell you? That tells you total sugar, all of the sugars in the Cheerios are added sugars. If there are any naturally occurring sugars in here, it's negligible. And, I wouldn't expect you to be able to figure out the tiny little bit of sugar that's added in there. If there's 10 grams of total sugar and 10 of those grams are added sugar, it's 100% added sugar. So let's go back in here and look, we don't really have anything in here that would kind of scream out. Well, I think, like I already mentioned, the caramel color and the chocolate, that's a little tricky. Like you might think there's sugar in there. But as far as a naturally occurring sugar, there really isn't anything in here that would be a naturally occurring sugar. And we'll get to that. I'll have another example for that later. So what is the recommended intake? Well, actually, I don't like recommended intake. It makes it sound like there's a goal for added sugar when really there is an upper limit. There's a limit and we should be below that. So the American Heart Association, you can abbreviate it AHA if you'd like, just easier. American Heart Association, added sugar, upper limit is less than 5% of total calories. And I'm not actually going to ask you to do the math on this. It's in general about 100 to 150 calories a day from sugar. If you're thinking about it in grams, that's about 6 to 9 teaspoons of sugar per day, or 25 to 35 grams per day. Generally, they say that women are going to be on the lower end of this and men will be on the upper end, but also younger adults will be on the lower end. More active adults will be on the upper end, and then less active people on the lower end. Older adults will need less than younger adults, right? So it's based on a percent of total calories. So that means that if you're burning more calories, then generally your body can handle more sugar. But again, this is the upper limit, not something to achieve. You should know the value, less than 5% of the diet. I don't expect you to do the math on that. If you want to stick to 25 to 35 grams a day, I think that's acceptable to remember for any sort of a science, your client diet analysis, midterm, that type of thing. So let's just look at an example. Let's look at a breakfast. So let's pretend that this little cup of coffee here is actually one of those fancy lattes from Starbucks. It's got a squirt of maybe a vanilla flavoring that has also a lot of sugar, 16 grams of it. So maybe they have a piece of toast. Maybe it has butter on it. Let's say it doesn't have jam. So there's no additional added sugar in there, but toast. And then we have some yogurt, flavored yogurt, blueberry flavored, let's just say. And you'll find that a lot of those flavored yogurts, which I like to call refrigerated ice cream. Not my term. I got that from someone else. I can't remember who. But because there's so much sugar in those flavored yogurts. So what does that do? What does that get us to? If we added that all up, that is 30 grams of added sugar. So why is this added? There's actually, for this coffee here, we're not getting into the details on it, but there would be sugar in the milk because it's a latte that's naturally occurring. That's an addition to the 16 grams. So this is just 16 grams of sugar in the flavored latte. And then we have kind of smaller amounts here. My point is, look how fast this adds up. And we just talked about how 25 to 35 grams a day is the upper limit for the entire day. And someone can easily get this just at breakfast. Okay, so again, I'm just trying to emphasize, if it's an added sugar is any sugar that is added to a food product. Now, if you have an ultra-processed food product, it gets a little bit more complicated, but I want you to know just the basics, the main types of added sugar and how to locate them on a nutrition facts panel in the ingredient list, and to differentiate from naturally occurring sugar. And this is where I know it gets a little bit confusing. But a naturally occurring sugar is a sugar that occurs in a food. An added sugar is something that's taken out of the food, gets refined, and then gets put back into a food product, right? So these are whole foods. Fructose is found in fruit and vegetables. Small amounts in other things, like we talked about nuts and grains, but for the most part, fruits and vegetables. Lactose, mainly in milk, dairy products. Glucose and sucrose. So these will be in fruits and veggies, nuts and grains. Like I said, small extent fructose. But this is something you should know. This type of sugar occurs naturally in the food, not the food product, just a whole food. Let's take a look at some marinara sauce, Italian pasta sauce. This is Prego brand. We look down at the nutrition facts panel and it says 8 grams of total sugar. So it's all the sugar in for one serving. They actually tell us 3 grams of added sugar. Okay, so let's see here. So that's 8 grams of total sugar, 3 grams of added sugar. 8 minus 3 is 5. That means there are 5 grams of naturally occurring sugar. So I'm going to go back here before I get to that slide. Let's just look at this ingredient list here. 3 grams of added sugar. So the first thing we do is we search and we say, aha, we found it, sugar. If it says sugar on the ingredient list, it's sucrose. I just want you to be able to identify the types of sugar. We look through everything else and Nothing else in here says added sugar. Looks like added sugar. Don't ignore that contains less than 1% of salt, 1% of, and then salt, canola oil, dried vegetable, all of those things. In general, it is not as important for sugar because this is by weight, but in general, this is usually where all the food additives live, and it's because it's by weight, and you only need a tiny little bit of food additive or a small amount of salt, and it's gonna weigh just so much less than, say, a tomato, right? Salt, tomato, I mean, the tomato's gonna weigh a lot more, but the salt, potentially, a little bit of salt could have a much greater physiologic effect. And the same with a bunch of food additives and whatnot. So in general, don't ignore that contains less than 1%, but it's not as important for the sugar discussion. Okay, so sugar is our added sugar, 5 grams of naturally occurring sugar. So now we have to say, okay, what's a naturally occurring sugar? It's, okay, we're going to look not for, say, fructose or lactose or galactose. We're not looking for that, right? We're looking for a food because naturally occurring sugar occurs in whole foods. So which ingredients in this list are whole foods? Okay, well, we have the tomato puree. Yeah, that's lightly processed, definitely. Diced tomatoes, also lightly processed. Tomato juice, that's also lightly processed. So each of these are mostly whole or lightly processed foods. And we can say, tomatoes. Tomatoes have fructose. Then food with naturally occurring sugar in this is a tomato, and the fructose is the most likely type of sugar in the tomato. That's it. So this is just the way I want you to think about added sugars and to differentiate it from whole food with naturally occurring sugar. So if you're eating this apple or a lightly processed version of this apple, you're going to get fructose, but it's going to be buried within this apple. If some company is taking fructose out of an apple, let's just say, and this is not the exact process, but it is going through to a lab and it's going through all these processes before it actually ends up in, say, in some food item. It is so different than where it came from, right? Now you just have this, they have taken it out, let's say, of the apple, which they don't usually use apples. Beets would be a better example, but taken that, say, fructose out, gone through all these processes, and now it's in this form. So it looks nothing like this, right? So this is what an added sugar is going to be. Fructose within this big package is a naturally occurring sugar. So when you think added sugar, it's pulled out of the food, refined, processed, whatever they do, that I don't even know all the steps, and then they put it back into a food product, right? Not a whole food. Okay, so we already went through that, and this is kind of my emphasis here. It's all about the package the sugar comes in. So if it's in an apple, it comes with phytochemicals, also called phytonutrients. These are plant chemicals that have beneficial effects on the body. It comes with fiber, with vitamins and minerals. You get the full package. If you take that fructose out and it goes through all these processes, that's all you're getting. Straight shot of sugar. And again, our micronutrients, phytochemicals, fiber, these are all the things that come in the package. I have this lattice back here, this kind of fence-looking lattice, to show you the effect of soluble and insoluble fiber and how they work together. We talked about fiber. Insoluble fiber creates this matrix. Soluble fiber can help fill in the gaps. And what that does is it helps to slow the absorption of, I have glucose here, but it could also be fructose. Remember that our disaccharides, or it even could be starch, They're digested down to monosaccharides, those single sugars, before they get absorbed. So here's an example. These glucose chains, they get broken down and then they get absorbed. Now, if they have this lattice that they have to go through, it's going to be hard to get through all those cracks, right? It's going to really slow down that absorption process. And that means there's just a slow, steady stream, whether it's glucose or fructose. It could be galactose, but there's just not that much galactose in our food supply compared to the other sugars. So there's a slow, steady stream that helps regulate our blood glucose, and it helps minimize the effect on the liver, particularly with fructose. So when you have a processed food, a lot of times it'll show that it has fiber in it, but if you're buying something and it's not really gritty at all, and it's got this fine, smooth taste, I'm thinking of bread, and you think, wow, how can this have fiber in it? Well, yeah, it started with fiber, but they have like chopped it up and blended it so fine that now you just have all these little chunks of insoluble fiber. The insoluble fiber, remember, that's the structure for the plant. It's kind of that hard outer edge. So you know when you're eating a bread that has a little more texture, a little more grit to it, compared to something that just, you put it in your mouth and it just melts. Well, there's probably not a lot of fiber, but if it says there's fiber on there, it is probably broken down into these little bits. So the reason I have it here is think about the glucose or the fructose getting into the bloodstream. The absorption rate is not going to be slowed as much. Okay, so if we don't have the intact fiber, it's just, this is kind of like my analogy. You go from the full bathtub and you have this drain, and that little drain there is like your fiber. But if you kind of take that out, you take it apart, it's essentially just going to drain right away. So, if you don't have the intact fiber, it's done, it's gone. But let's say you do have the intact fiber. So the analogy is that drain is actually working. I mean, you've seen it. And then maybe it has like some stuff from the bathtub in there. And it's kind of this really slow draining process. And that is essentially kind of the analogy you can use when you think about it absorbing into the bloodstream. Okay, we're finishing up with this. I just want to talk a little bit about high fructose corn syrup. It's not as prevalent as it used to be, but you'll still find it in so many processed foods. High fructose corn syrup is actually made from starch. And if you knew a little bit about starch, you remember these are glucose, right? It's just glucose, just linked together, all linked together, packed together. They take that starch and they put it through a process that yields a maltose and then 2-glucose. Okay, so that's similar to our digestion process, right? Except for it'd be glucose chains, maltose, glucose, and glucose. But what they do in the lab is then they convert glucose to fructose. And it's just a little bit more, about 55%, and that just a little bit more fructose and glucose. There might be a little bit of sucrose that forms, but that's going to be the high fructose corn syrup. So it's not a substantial amount of extra fructose. Just remember that the body handles fructose differently than glucose. Glucose is our fuel. Fructose has to go to the liver to be converted to glucose. And when we get a straight shot of that, meaning there's not a lot of fiber, soluble and insoluble, to slow that absorption process, and that goes to the liver, that ends up causing problems for the liver. It affects our metabolic health. And probably the fastest way to impact metabolic health in a detrimental way is to drink soda, because you're going to have a lot of high fructose corn syrup found in soda. All right, well, that's it for this lesson for now.